Welcome to Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I have a very special guest today, all the way from Dakar. His name is Gilles Yabi. He is the founder of a very special think tank. It's called the West African Citizens Think Tank. And the reason I invited him to this interview is because I read a very interesting article written by him on the Institut Montaigne website, where he argued that for people in Africa, for instance, and I felt the same for people in India, our perspective to the war in Ukraine could be very different from that in the West. And therefore, I invited Mr. Yabi to come to this interview and talk to us about this perspective and how geography determines how countries like India, countries in Africa might look at the Ukraine situation differently. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for hosting me.
Let me begin by putting that question to you then, the one that you wrote about in your article. Why is it different from our perspective, the war in Ukraine?
Yes, I think the issue is how different countries, different societies in the world see an event. And of course, the crisis in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine is an important event, not just for Ukraine and Russia, the direct protagonists of the war, but also for Europe and also for the world, because it is a war. It is extremely violent. We still don't know actually the actual number of casualties, but it is very important one, military and civilian. So it is a drama. And I think every war, everywhere in the world is a drama and should be a concern for all humanity. But of course, when we get into the hierarchy of crisis, of concerns, unfortunately, there is an hierarchy, and definitely the way people would be seeing the war in Ukraine from Senegal, from Benin, from Nigeria, from South Africa, or from India will be different from the way people would see it from Paris or from London or from the US. So my point was to say that in Africa, we are concerned by what is going on, also because it has economic and geopolitical impact on the African continent, and also because it might change a number of balances in the world at the end of this conflict. We don't know actually what it will lead to. So we are living in a very uncertain world, and that has consequences for everyone. But at the same time, there are many conflicts going on in some African countries. In other part of the world, we also have several conflicts, very violent. Yemen, for example, is something extremely terrible, but which is not in the news. And it is important for us to say that we should be looking at all violence in the world, and we should be looking also at other priorities that we might have, especially the one that I mentioned in this article was climate change, which is something which already have important impact on the life of people, and will have more and more impact on the life of people here in Africa, but also in other parts of the world.
What you're saying is very important because it touches upon many, many aspects. Number one, and let me, take each issue out, so to speak. Number one, let's talk about conflict first. You're saying that in the way the world looks at conflict, especially in the way the world media, which often means the Western media, looks at conflict, there is a hierarchy. And therefore, when the conflict is in the West or at its doorstep, like it is in Ukraine, that gets central attention, main attention. Whereas there are many other conflicts in the world, perhaps more terrible than the Ukraine war in the past, and perhaps even today going on. You mentioned Yemen, for instance, which do not get that kind of attention because of their geography. Geography determines destiny. Isn't that what you're saying?
Yes, it is an important part of what I'm saying. The point that, yes, geography definitely determines the kind of attention that is given kind of globally to a conflict. But I think it is also a reflection of the economic order. You mentioned the media. The reality is that it is a reflection of the power of Western media. If you have a more balanced kind of order of media in the world, then you would expect kind of the presence of over conflicts, in the global media, but the global media tend to be dominated by Western media. So of course, it reflects the perspective of what is actually most important for the Western audience, and then again, because of the economic influence of those media, you have the feeling everywhere in the world that the hierarchy that is decided by the West is actually the hierarchy that should be the same for everyone. So yes, that's the point. But I think the other issue is also about the reaction of of major powers to conflicts in different places, and also the fact that in some instances it is also the Western powers were involved in those conflicts that have massive consequences on the life of people. And in that case, we do not have the same kind of international reaction that the one that we saw after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia.
The other topic that you mentioned in your essay that you wrote for Institute Montaigne, which in a sense kickstarted our conversation, is that you mentioned climate change actually is a much bigger issue for many parts of the world. Global warming is a much bigger issue in many parts of the world than the war in Ukraine. This is a controversial thing to say because the war is going on right now, but anybody with a little bit of sort of broad, expansive thinking would see that what you're saying is right. Global warming threatens in many ways the very existence of many nations in various parts of the world, perhaps not so much in Northern Europe and North America, but certainly in other parts of the world. And in that sense, perhaps is far more important than the war in Ukraine. No doubt the war in Ukraine is important, but global warming is far more important, and it isn't getting the kind of attention that it deserves. I want to ask you, sitting where you are in Senegal, in Dakar, what are you seeing around you in terms of global warming, which is not getting enough attention in global media?
Well, I think before responding to that, I just want to mention the fact that it's true that I was not necessarily very happy with the title that was chosen for my article. The fact that we're saying that global warming is more important for African, for example, than the war in Ukraine, because of course the war in Ukraine is important, and I think it's not very nice to have to make a hierarchy between priorities, but the reality is that we should face also the reality, and we should be talking about the issues that are all important for every society. So that was the point. The point was not to say that the war in Ukraine was not that important. And also you mentioned the fact that, you can have massive consequences for the world, the global warming, but also the war in Ukraine, because it involves powers that have nuclear weapon. We cannot exclude the possibility also of something that is, a major threat to the world as well. So I want to be clear about that. And then on your question about global warming, I would not necessarily mention specifically Senegal, where I'm based. Also because the perspective of the think tank that I manage from Senegal is a West African perspective, and is even an African perspective. So it's not limited to one country. And we do know that global warming precisely, its effects cannot be just defined by a border of countries. But the reality today is that we already have this year a number of floods, for example, in Nigeria, with thousands of people who were killed, and we have also important floods in Niger, in other countries of the Sahel, where at the same time you have regions where you have drought and you have difficulties of people to have access to agricultural product and then to food. So we already have a lot of actual consequences of global warming. And what's going to happen more and more is these at the same time, you might have countries where you have floods, and in over period of the year, you have droughts and difficult access to food. We are talking about countries which already experience regular shortage of foods for the populations. We're also talking about a region of the world where the population is growing very fast. Africa is where you have the most important demographic growth in the world. So, and that's going to, it's not just now, it will be the case for the several decades that are coming. So the issue is how we'll be able to improve the life of people, given the current situation, which is already difficult, and given the impact of global warming, especially on production of food, for example, but also on a number of natural catastrophes that are going to come. So yes, I think when we have a look at all the dimensions, what's going to happen in terms of the economy, but also in terms of basically the daily life of people, then we realize that global warming is absolutely essential as a threat to the continent and to other parts of the world, including islands that could disappear, not only in Africa, but in other places in the world.
Let's talk about the other point that you just mentioned in your last answer, which is that Africa is a place where the population is growing very rapidly. Indeed, in global economic analysis, after Asia and after South Asia, India, where I come from, after our part of the world, the next great frontier of growth is said to be Africa, where the future of world growth will come from in the next 100 years, 50 to 100 years, right? And this growth, people are beginning to talk about how the next frontier is Africa. Now, tell me how you see this. Sitting where you are, how do you balance these two things? One is, of course, the impact of global warming. The other is Africa increasingly being seen as the next frontier, the next engine, in a sense, after Asia, of world economic growth.
I think it is a complex issue. I'm trained as an economist initially, but I have a lot of reservations about the discussion about growth, the relationship between economic growth and economic and social development. I think it is extremely difficult to define what is economic development, and I think that is certainly wrong to say that or to think that economic growth means necessarily economic and social progress for the people. And I think that we cannot discuss growth, in the current times in the same way that as we used to discuss growth several decades ago, now that we realized that the economic growth of a number of countries, powerful and rich countries, precisely has been also, destructive to the planet, and so there is a cost to this economic growth. And I think in Africa and probably also in Asia, it is important maybe to redefine what is important, to redefine what are the priorities now for our societies and for the futures. Is it kind of trying to get the maximum of economic growth, including at a very high human cost and high cost for the planet, or are we going to have a different trajectory where we'll be improving the life of the people, fighting inequality, for example, and at the same time preserving the nature, which is actually the basis of all economic activities? So that's why I don't think that talking about the next frontier might be an important, good for people who are working in finance. But for us, I think for those who have to make decisions about the future on economy, on energy, on a lot of issues. We should be focused on the improvement of the life of people, the quality of life of people, and to make sure that we are creating, for the future generations, an environment of peace, stability, and some sense of preservation of the planet as well. And then, yes, the demography of the continent means that the needs will be extremely important. And so when you have a lot of people who will have a lot of needs, then it will be an engine for economic growth. But the real question is who is going to benefit from these demographic growth. It should be the people, of the countries where you are having these demographic boom, and I'm not sure that we have, for now, the capacity to have these autonomy in defining what is important for us and what should be the priorities in building the future.
Fascinating. What you're saying, of course, is slightly different from the narrative we have heard in the last couple of years of a common African market, the value of a common African market, what a common African market could contribute to the global economy, and so on and so forth. I want to ask you, it's certainly happening in Asia, in my country, India, and I wonder if it's happening in Africa too, where people are turning to their own history to find indigenous ways of living, which they now feel is far more attuned or sustainable to their everyday lifestyle than blindly aping the processes of the West. For instance, I'll give you one example: architecture. Just by aping buildings that are built in New York or London doesn't make sense in the climatic conditions of New Delhi or Mumbai, right? And a lot of people are beginning to talk about this and realize this. Is that happening in Africa too? And if yes, if you could give us some examples.
Yes, it is interesting that you are mentioning that. It is happening. I think it is quite new, but it is happening. You mentioned architecture. There are a number of African architects who are also trying to develop the idea that we should build house differently, that we should stop buildings that are just not consistent with the temperature that we have in our countries. And but for now, it's still quite limited. The big infrastructure project of the states don't seem to reflect this need for adaptation. So it is still very difficult to see within the policy circles an understanding of these needs to think differently. But I think that you have actors of the society, actors of the economy who are now pushing for this kind of adaptation and this kind of autonomous thinking about how we should build place, what should be the choices in terms of the mix of energy, what should be the choices in terms of centralization versus decentralization, so that we don't have big cities where you cannot actually have the kind of services that are needed. So I think it is something which is emerging, but which is still quite limited and not having the kind of impact that it should have on the big decisions that are being made by the policymakers in the continent. But I think also one of the implication of the global warming, and at least the discussion about that, is that yes, at least people are now realizing that the trajectory that has been taken by most of the Western countries for decades or even for more than a century, that this trajectory is certainly not sustainable. If everyone has to live in the way that the average American citizen lives, then the planet will just not survive at that. So I think people are realizing that, but it is still difficult to translate that into actual change in the way we see development. That's why I was saying that I have a lot of reservation about the world development, because we have to put a clear content on that, and we have probably to put a political content in that, in terms of what is the balances that we want between maximum of economic growth and, for example, reducing significantly the inequality within a society.
Fascinating. I want to ask you one last question because you mentioned energy, and I'm fascinated by energy use in countries because clearly these are deep concerns both in Africa and in Asia. You correctly pointed out that if an average African or an average Indian started to use energy quite like an average American, there would be no planet left. It's impossible, right? Now, in that situation, I wonder if you could give us an idea of how renewable energy is being seen in Africa. You know, what I know, it's obviously there are many countries in Africa. Each country will have its own, way of looking at it. But is there an average? Is there a mood that's building towards renewable energy? Is there what kind of conversation is happening about changing the energy mix from, say, fossil fuels to maybe other kind of energy in a country or in a region, once again, quite like Asia, blessed with abundant sunshine, with abundant water availability, at least in many parts, and so on and so forth.
Yes, again, energy is extremely important and it is a complex issue also. We have a conversation actually at my think tank with the number 2 of the international group which work on climate change just several weeks ago. And it was really fascinating, to see how connected, of course, the issue of energy is to the issue of global warming and how difficult it is for the countries to make the right choices. Because those choices are not simple. Some countries in Africa have just discovered massive reserve of gas, for example, including Senegal, but also Mozambique. And these countries, of course, are saying that we need to exploit our reserves to do exactly what other countries have been doing for decades. It is extremely difficult to say just no, you don't have the right to exploit your reserve now. But I think the message of those who work really on this sector is to say that probably we need to take into account specific context of countries. We are not, including within the African continent, the situation of South Africa is quite different from the situation in Burkina Faso, for example, in terms of the current access, for example, of a population to energy. It is quite limited in a number of countries. So for these countries, you still need to create the condition to improve the life of people by just giving access to electricity. And you might explore, for example, solar energy, renewable energies, to have decentralized system so that people can have access to electricity in villages, in urban areas, for example. And I think that solar energy and over renewable are definitely should be the priority for many countries. But for other countries, you cannot again say that you abandon totally the fossil fuel, but at the same time they have to project their need. They have also to understand that there is no need to say that over have polluted the world and then we have to pollute at the same pace because we will destroy the planet. So it is clear that the situation is unequal, that probably poor countries are paying the cost of what the rich countries did, but there is a collective responsibility now to find the right pathways that at the same time preserve the improvement of the life of people where this life of people have to be improved, and at the same time preserve the planet. But there is no easy solution to that, and I think it is important to have this also message to the citizens of the world that there is no quick fix to this kind of problem, and that there is a need to invest in technology, in education, and then also in political dialogue about all those issues, including energy choices, because it is a political issue.
Fascinating. Gilles Yabi, for joining me from Dakar today. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you for all your insights, and thank you for joining Global Order for this wonderful conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Thank you.